And I'll start off. So I'd like to thank everybody for joining us for the second session of our spring program for the Virtual Inter-University Symposium on Infrastructure Management. So today we'll have presentations by Deepak Benny and Priyadarshan Patil on their research. And so each presentation should be about 20 minutes long, and we really encourage audience participation and questions after through a 10-minute Q&A session for each speaker. Thank you all for attending once again. And with this, I'd like to introduce our first presenter. So Deepak Benny is a PhD student in transportation engineering at Purdue University with a focus on infrastructure finance. Deepak carries experience in planning, design, construction of infrastructure assets, including roads, ports, marine terminals, industrial SCVs, as well as the built environment and other transportation infrastructure. He has worked with international consulting firms based in Singapore, India, and has varied project experience across Southeast Asia, India, the Middle East, and Europe. He holds a master's degree in sustainable engineering, marine technology from University of Glasgow in the UK, and a Master of Business Administration from the Indian Institute of Management in Calicut, India. So with this, I'd like to hand it over to Deepak, and please go ahead and feel free to share your screen.
Thank you, Adrian, for the introduction. Today's topic we had discussed is about the challenges faced by state transportation agencies, particularly in the case of identifying matching funds to receive federal grants. And this is a joint research happening between Purdue University and the Build America Center. So I'll introduce Build America Center later in the presentation. And we are supporting FSWA for a few of their projects. So for the contents for today's presentation, I'll introduce Build America Center research team, a bit about the bipartisan infrastructure law and how this project can help implementing the BIL. A few key terms that all of us might need to be aware running through the presentation. Then about the matching fund requirements, some of the challenges in identifying matching funds, the potential sources, and some of the best practices in arranging the matching funds. First of all, Build America Center was a center of excellence in project finance set up in 2022 with the help of US DOT funding. And the goal is to support the Build America Bureau and the FSWA for innovative transportation project financing and delivery. And it has a nationwide partnership, including 5 universities, including Stanford, Georgia Tech, Virginia Tech, University of Maryland, and Purdue as a Midwest regional partner. There are a few industry partners and government partners as well. Rebel Group is a consultant team supporting the venture. We have support from ASTO, American Road and Transport Builder Association, National Governors Association, and the National Association of Counties. The key activities of the Build America Center includes research on various topics that has been jointly decided along with FSWA, training and education, technical assistance to non-federal agencies regarding federal grants, policy guidance, and capacity building. A data center of project finance is also under development at the Build America Center. It is available in the website. We can see it on the right side, bac.umd.edu. It has a database of large projects happening in the nation, as well as BIL Launchpad, where local agencies can help gain assistance for submitting the applications for federal grants. The current research is about matching funds estimation, which Build America Center has been working in association with Purdue. So getting a bit into the bipartisan infrastructure law. So bipartisan infrastructure law is the latest in the series of the surface transportation legislation, so which is actually a multi-year funding bill for federal transportation investments. And typically it is passed for 5 to 7 years. And the surface transportation legislation established grant programs, set the rules for agencies receiving federal transportation funding, and describe the amounts for guaranteed funding, which each of the state will receive during the period of the said legislation. There are certain planning rules and policies set forth in these bills for the state DOTs, metropolitan organizations, and other local agencies. And as I said, the recent bill that happened was the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which is will be in effect for at least financial year 26. So if you look into the bipartisan infrastructure bill, it provides more than $1 trillion for infrastructure investments in the country. And it had brought in more than 550 billion in new investment versus the typical baseline programs that were happening under the federal existing programs. So what happened was that it effectively doubled the transportation investment in the nation, and there were no new investments across all modes of transportation: water, power and energy, environment, broadband, and resilience. So if you look at the new funding in the transportation sector, even in the pure transportation sector, there was around 284 billion worth of funds coming in, and there are more than 120 programs under the Department of Transportation. If you look at some of the key terms, the apportionment is basically the distribution of funds to states as prescribed by statutory formula. And there are typically two kinds of funding, either formula funded or discretionary funding. This is how funds are distributed to the states from the federal grants. So in case of formula funding, the apportions are based on a statutory formula, while in case of discretionary funding, also known as competitive bidding, competitive grants, where the grants can be received only upon a competitive basis set forth in the application forms. And this is typically issued during the notice for funding opportunity. So what happens in this to receive the funds is that states need to share a particular cost in order to get the funds received from federal entities. So these are some of the typical cost share guidelines. If it is a project on an interstate system, 90% will be funded from the federal, and at least 10% have to be brought in from the state agencies, who is actually the overseer of the project. Other projects in the national highway system will be getting only 80%, but some projects with safety improvement focus will get 100%. For locations for projects within tribal area or federal lands, we get 100%, and it varies from project to project. Hence, the remaining cost share need to be brought in by the grantee or the state or the local agencies. So if you look at a sample set of 10 programs, which is representative of some of the top programs, we can see around $300+ billion are coming through these programs to the states. This is the total fund for 22 to 26. This is some of the cost share requirements that is coming from these projects. Some spending from 80% to 90%. And what it means to the agencies is that if you look at a particular year in a state like Illinois, which will be receiving around 2.2 billion worth of funds from these 10 programs. But to receive those 2.2 billion worth of funds, Illinois has to raise around $550 million. So that is a huge amount to be raised. So what happened was that even though the funding has increased more, wherein transportation funds have doubled, we can see that there's a huge investment required from the state agencies to match the federal dollars. So there are lots of challenges currently faced by the agencies in order to raise this amount. Particularly one, as we all have been seeing, there is a huge decline happening in the fuel tax revenues, particularly because of popularities increasing in alternative fuel vehicles, electric vehicles, and vehicles are becoming more efficient, and accordingly a huge decline, which was the primary source of income for the states, are on a declining trend. There was also a huge decline due to economic downturns, due to the impact of COVID and recession activities. But what happened was that the funds which are reserved for investments or asset management gets used for the actual operations for the activities within the state. And due to the increased funds needed for preserving the aging infrastructure in the states, there are less priority seen for new capital investments. Again, there are effects due to the inflation. Increased budgets are required for handling the infrastructure projects within the state. Even there are issues with the construction delays, which typically not only cause the cost overruns, but also reduces the revenue from economic benefits like taxes that can actually get developed from the region. So what happens in the matching is that the non-federal share of the match can include either a cash, it can come from third-party activities like personal goods, space, and other utilities. And then there are some soft match options as well. So typically what happens was that when 80% of the funds come from the federal, remaining 20% what need to be raised in by state agency. But there are some certain permits that happen in order to reduce the match, the cash match required. There is an option called in-kind match, which is very less currently extensively used by the states. So in an in-kind match, basically coming from the personnel services of the third-party activities that are happening, the cash match can be avoided. So we will see some examples later on how this in-kind match can be brought in. So once the third-party in-kind matches are brought in, including the designs or the services that happened for the project, the cash outlay can be reduced. So typically, three kinds of matches can be engaged, which includes the cash, in-kind, and soft match. But the cash match can come from either of the grantee or the third party or the federal agencies. But typically, in case of federal agencies, these are permitted only under flexible match provisions. Only a certain type of federal funds can be used as a cash match. In-kind match can come only from a third party. Whereas a soft match, there are provisions for things like toll credits or off-system bridge credits that can be used for the match. I'll explain a bit of the toll credits later in the system. So if you look at the typical source of matching fund, this is supported by the state legislature or local budget when the taxes from the contribute to the state legislature or the budget. These are the earnings from the taxes. It could be advertising fees, fuels, leases, other kind of sales tax, right-of-way fees, and typical funds that states receive. And the need for the annual study streams is also critical in this case because it is needed to support the funds to match BIL grants. This also calls for alternate innovative mechanism. So as part of the BSc research, we had surveyed among 50 states to identify the sources of these funds. And I would like to introduce a few of the systems that are in place for the projects. This includes value capture methods, private-public partnerships, use of loans from state infrastructure banks or TIFIA, and revenue collection from tolls. Looking a bit into the value capture options, relies on the concepts of localized benefits generated by transportation infrastructure investments. Once these investments are made, there is a huge economic benefit that might happen at the location. So that benefits can be capitalized in order to get the benefits for value captures. So there are various methods authorized by the states in leveraging the benefits. A few of them include some of the developer contributions, special assessments. These are special assessment district where funds can be collected at a particular location, the taxes and the fees. There could be incremental growth funds that can come from the location, joint development funds, concessions, advertising, and naming rights. And FSWA has produced a detailed guideline on how value created by transportation can be capitalized. And they are strongly pushing states to actually start engaging value capture methods for funding. If you look into private-public partnerships, these are, as an introduction, these are contractual agreements between public agencies and private sector, wherein the private sector invest or operate in the public infrastructure at a particular location. And both parties contribute financially and share the risk and reward. So what happens is that we can bring in private expertise to assist the local agencies in formulating and bidding for competitive discretionary grants so that we can maximize the grants that can received in a state. It can potentially help in financing the matching funds in return for fixed incomes from state or other local agencies. And these are the states that have been extensively engaging P3s for funding. There is provisions for loans from state infrastructure banks, and these operate much like a private bank, but which are capitalized using federal funds. But the advantage is that there are possibilities of funding for short-term constructions, but with a long-term debt financing options. Funding for the project fully or partially is also possible. Advantages is that it offers at below market interest rates and flexible repayment terms, so that states need not stress much on the budgetary funds at the current moment. Similar loans are also offered from the federal government from a provision called TIFIA. This is a Transportation Infrastructure Finance and Innovative Act, wherein the repayment terms could be as long as maybe 30 to 40 years. And there are flexible repayment schedules, and it is also a stable source of income for financing, and it brings in a huge reduced risk for the state agencies. If you look into a methodology called toll credits, where the credits get accrued when capital investments are made in federally approved toll facilities. So if you get toll from a particular project which was approved from the federal agency, and that particular toll revenue can be reinvested into another project, it gains toll credits. And these toll credits can be used to match the federal funds and from my federal funds for a new particular year. So basically, this is allowed for interstate projects which promote interstate commerce, and it is used as a soft match provisions for substituting the match for receiving federal grants. The toll revenues may include toll receipts, concession sales, right-of-way lease revenues, or other bond or loan proceeds. So currently, more than 29 billion worth of funds are in hands of 30 states across the nation, which can be used to match the federal funds. So the traditional approach was the annual budget support from the state legislature, but we are pushing towards getting a new innovative approach which can come from contributions from in-kind matches plus developer donations. Extensively, candidates should look into value capture options, debt financing, as well as private investments. So the ongoing research at Purdue, we have been working with FSWA to provide innovative solutions into getting the matching funds. The key challenge is to pair the identified projects with a specific program, and which includes the eligibility criteria, the period of application, the matching fund requirement, the readiness of the project, etc. And these, once the projects are identified, optimization tools can be used to maximize access to the federal grants for state and local agencies. And what we are trying to achieve is to minimize the cash outflow, that is the budgetary support, by improving the identification of in-kind options and other kind of contributions. So that's all from my side. Thank you for listening and for the opportunity.
Thank you, Deepak. Very interesting work. I'd be very curious to know where your research goes. But so at this point, I'd open up for any questions from the audience.
I will ask you a question, Deepak. Actually, there are a couple. The first one you sort of addressed, and so when we talk about projects here, I assume essentially you allow for cash flows that occur throughout the life cycle of the project, and so I think that this came across when you were talking about tolling, but I was curious. I was curious about that a little bit. So, for example, these in-kind contributions that states or operators might make, they might come in the form of expenses like maintenance expenses that might come on later on.
So typically what happens is that once states need to receive funds from federal agencies, they need to invest a particular amount in that particular year for the capital construction work itself. It does not include the maintenance part of it. So the maintenance fully need to be taken care by the states at the later stage. These are mostly for capital revamping or overlay projects or things like that, or a bridge reconstruction or things like that. So to bring that money itself needs a huge investment at the initial stage from the states.
I see. So when you talked about tolling, this was more in terms of recovering these.
Yes.
I see. And a little bit of a different question is that in designing these systems, and I think that this is along the lines of the work that you were saying, and I wasn't sure what your what your take on it was, but basically, are there benefits in terms of cost sharing more? And so, in other words, could a state get more projects if they are able and willing to propose cost share schemes where they go beyond like the 10 or 20% that you showed us in terms of the statistics?
No, basically, if a state shares more, what happens is that the federal share will come down because the federal shares are fixed for every particular year. So if let's say the state share comes 30% and federal share comes 70%, that fund will not be apportioned to that particular state. So there is no advantage in overmatching. But what we are trying to say is that rather than bringing in cash as a direct option from the budget, a state should start exploring more of the in-kind options, so that there could be a huge advantage in reducing the cash outlay by the state, because those are theoretically allowed for all the projects.
Thank you.
Arnold, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Deepak, for your interesting and informative presentation. It's a well, I forgot to I should introduce myself briefly, although Sam knows me. So I'm actually coming from Toronto, Canada. It's another country, but it's so interesting to see that, of course, we all knew the big infrastructure investment bill that has been passed. That's very interesting one, and then also interesting to see the bigger portfolio of the alternative financing method. And when you show the overall distribution of the P3, the public-private partnerships that has been used in US, that's something very interesting to see. I happen to be one of what we call the founding director for, at that time we called it the RIII, one of the major mandate, which I had to admit that we failed in the end. It was to promote the Canadian P3 model and trying to sell it to the South. And for a variety of reasons, it doesn't seem to be very successful, but it seems to be very interesting to see that the overall P3 adoption has been increased. So actually, it's not a question, it's more kind of a comment for your information that in Ontario, at least, we are using P3 models very extensively, particularly in the first 20 years of the past 20 years. Even though that actually the adaptation, the utilization of a P3 model is kind of shying away a little bit due to the political reasons. However, in Ontario or in Canada, I'm not sure, maybe Sam already familiar with that. We had a CCPPP database. that actually stored most of the Canadian P3 projects. That I don't know, maybe in the future you can, if you haven't, that can be something that you can look at if you need some empirical data. So yeah, if you need any help in the future, let me know, and then I can help you to connect with them. Sometimes I think they still charge for the data access, but I'm not sure for the academic research, maybe they can make it free. Well, again, congratulations for this big research center, and all the best. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Yuan. Yeah, we'll definitely be in touch with you to see how we can leverage the opportunities. Because we have been in discussion with how P3s can be, private agencies can be engaged at the earlier stage, so that they can also assist in preparing the grant applications plus finance some of the matching funds, so that state or other local parties, because state DOTs might not be having that issues, but if you look into the lower tiers, like local communities, they might need huge support in rolling out these projects. So private parties can actually assist in helping them run these projects, as well as put a part into the financing of the projects.
Yeah, that's great.
Thank you.
Yeah, I had a question. So I wonder if you know of if there are any like ongoing schemes for states to basically like redefine vehicle taxes or fees now for maybe I've heard like discussion of mileage based fees now that you know the gas taxes, well, it hasn't been updated in 2 decades, but it's increasingly coming under threat because of electric vehicles. And I see this as a potential source of revenue for states for providing these matching funds, even though you're looking at identifying other methods. But I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yes, thank you, Adrian. So exactly that is a topic which Purdue is pursuing in 2023. So we have started working on that project with FSWA to bring out alternative tax or fees mechanisms once EVs are in the market. So some states have already rolled it out, but to bring in a uniformity, we are trying to come up with some kind of policy level principles on how that can be adopted across the nation. So there are ongoing on that part.
Right.
EV adoption. Professor Sam can also.
Right, and to add to that, yes, and to add to that, in fact, the question is extremely good. We all know the gas tax is not sustainable, right? And even if you get the electricity fee, electric vehicle fee or tax, the fundamental questions may still remain. Will there be equity? You know, are we going to charge the trucks their real share of damage? You know, because right now they are underpaying their real share, and that's causing some inefficiencies or inadequacies in the money from the fuel tax. You know, so I think that even with the EV fee, the fundamental issues will remain. The VMT fee, however, has more promise, especially when it's weighted by distance. Sorry, if it's adjusted by weight. So we have actually a weighted distance tax, you know. But even if just plain VMT fee still, the trucks, of course, will pay more, their fair share, and that has potential to close the gap, and also has potential to bring more equity across the different classes of vehicles. Now, the question you asked was also, is there any state that has implemented VMT fee? To my knowledge, no. You know, it's politically, it's a hot potato, you know. Not many people want to bring in any new fees of taxes in the US that will cause them to lose an election, you know. So I don't think any state has implemented VMT fee full scale. There might be a few states, maybe Oregon, I'm not sure, that have begun experimental, you know, probably. But on a full scale, I don't think any state has done this, the VMT fee. And I think it's going to be difficult, but the forces are aligning in the future. I think that's inevitable, that a time will come when there'll be no way out. You know, it will have to be a fee like that.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Welcome.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, so with that, thank you again, Deepak, for your presentation.
Okay.
And I'd like to introduce our next speaker. So Priyadarshan Patil is an applied scientist at Amazon, working with their network planning team. He has a PhD in operations research from the University of Texas at Austin, focusing on traffic assignment models and solution algorithms. Priyadarshan obtained his bachelor's degree in civil engineering at the Indian Institute of Technology, Madras, and a master's degree in transportation engineering from the University of Texas at Austin. His research focuses are on network optimization, electrification and clean energy, and resilience. So with that, I'll hand it over to Priyadarshan.
Thank you so much, Adrian. So let me just share my screen. All right. Can you all see my screen?
Yeah.
All right, cool. Thank you. So today I want to talk to all of you about railroad electrification and just trying to understand what goes into railroad electrification and looking at one approach to determine which links or which corridors should be electrified in the US. So before we move any further, just a brief outline of the presentation. I'll give a little bit of context about where we are in terms of electrification, some of the prior work, research work that has been conducted in this space. After that, we'll look at the exact problem that we are trying to solve or model here, then look at the details of the modeling, the solution approaches, and then look at a case study of the US network. So with that, let's get started. So I don't think I need to sell all of you on the benefits of electrification. Electrification is, in general, the way forward. It's good for the environment. It's good for pollution levels. It's good for like sustainability. However, when we are talking about railroad electrification, there are a few key challenges that stand in the way. Most importantly, the biggest challenge that is facing us now is that there is a significant upfront investment for railroad electrification in terms of infrastructure upgrades. In addition to that, there are also associated infrastructure maintenance costs because, again, we are talking about railroads. These are all open air systems. These are all subject to extreme weather conditions in the middle of the US and like extreme various kind of natural disasters. In addition to that, given the current tax structures, property taxes and things like that, there are also higher property taxes. And as of this moment, there's just a general uncertainty around this sort of investment. So railroads right now are hesitant to invest in electrification. As you can see, right now in the US, there are like 1,500 kilometers out of like 300,000 kilometers of total railroad tracks that have been electrified. Comparing that to, say, China, which has more than 70% of its network electrified, or India, which has around 70% of its network electrified as well, this number stands, well, pretty low. We are not talking about, say, Europe or Japan, which have a higher percentage of the network electrified, but a lower share of it is used for freight. So we are comparing it to more economies that are, closer. So why, like, what's the kind of research that has been done so far? So, well, research into electrification has always happened whenever oil prices have been high. So the first time research started into railroad electrification was back in the 70s and 80s. Some of you may be familiar with the 1970s oil crisis, where oil prices went super high. So research started looking at what are some of the infrastructure costs that go into it, or what are some of the benefits of electrification. And then oil prices came down, research stopped. Again, in 2010s, research picked up cause, well, oil prices went high. And the research this time mainly focused on the benefits of electrification in terms of reducing pollution in urban areas. So there was some research from some of the California governments, some research from UIUC's Rail Center, but most of it looked at how they could reduce pollution in urban centers. So here's some major observations from these summaries. The first is that, again, costs were the biggest concern. Emissions were secondary concerns closer to 2010s, but not really studied all that well. The second and a major observation was that confining electrification to smaller regions was not effective. And the reason for that is switching costs. So the way electrification works is you need to switch from a diesel engine to a electric engine and vice versa if a track is not electrified. So switching costs or switching takes up to 6 hours, takes crew time, and so on and so forth. So there's a significant cost that is associated with this. So keeping that in mind, confining electrification to just like smaller stretches is not beneficial. And the last thing is some of these studies try to use traffic density or the tracks with the highest traffic as a heuristic to gauge which tracks or stretches or corridors should be electrified. And well, that was not a particularly efficient heuristics from their results. So with that background, let's try to frame the problem that we are trying to solve. So we have our railroad network. We have some estimate of demand. Let us consider that deterministic for now. And how can we choose a subset of links or some sort of corridors to electrify that will provide us with either the greatest cost reduction or the greatest benefit? Now, to structure this problem, we have two levels. Because of the high upfront investments, we'll need some sort of government intervention or some sort of subsidy to help get these projects rolling. So at the higher level, we have some sort of a utilitarian schema, which is trying to look at general social benefit, and it's determining what will help the overall network best. However, if you look at the lower level, once these benefits are done, you have a bunch of different railroad companies who are looking out for their own interests. They want to minimize their own costs, and they're not trying to look at the benefit of the entire network. So these are in some way you can call them selfish. So you're trying to look at some sort of a user equilibrium or Nash-Corno equilibrium at the lower level. So you have a bi-level problem here, and we are trying to solve this problem. So the big question is, well, where does traffic assignment fit into all of this? So if you take a look at the lower level problem, that is various shipping companies are trying to send goods across the network at least cost to themselves. This can be modeled as a user equilibrium principle, as long as we are considering flows. If we consider discrete trains or discrete train cars, then yes, we will be unable to model this properly. But some of previous studies have actually shown that you can model this as a user equilibrium as long as you're looking at flows. So the interpretation of this is any unit ton of flow or good is cannot be shipped via an alternate route without unilaterally minimizing or reducing its cost. So therefore, that's the intuition we use to apply the traffic assignment problem to the lower level, right? So before we jump into the solution method, I just wanted to talk about, again, what's the physical intuition behind electrification, right? What is actually going on the ground? So when we say electrification, what happens is there is still one track or one set of tracks that is being shared between diesel and electric locomotives. So the total capacity of the track is still the same. If you could send 100 diesel trains before, you can send a total of 100 diesel plus electric trains after electrification. That does not change. However, what changes is partially the fuel consumption of the electric trains, which changes their travel cost and travel profile, right? So that's the kind of the physical intuition behind what goes on at electrification. Having talked to some subject matter experts, the idea behind electrification is that there are general train yards where trains can essentially switch locomotives, and that is where they switch from diesel mode of operation to electric mode of operation. So therefore, here are some of the contributions with this background. We propose this general bi-level program framework that we just talked about. Then we use symmetric traffic assignment to solve this. We'll talk about why it is symmetric and where the symmetry occurs. Then we look at algorithm B, popular solution method for traffic assignment, and how the formulae are applicable to symmetric traffic assignment. And then lastly, we look at a case study on the US network and identify some of the most important corridors for electrification, right? So this is a visualization of what I was talking about when I said electrification. So you have one set of tracks, and this is, say, a station or a yard. and then you have the same set of tracks leaving the yard. So what happens at the yard is essentially, say, diesel trains come in, they switch from diesel mode to electric mode, and then they leave as electric trains. Or electric trains come in, they switch mode from electric to diesel, and then they leave as diesel trains. Or they can, not switch, and then electric trains leave as electric. So this is a general idea of modeling flow on the network. Now, let me just talk very briefly about the cost component. So as I said, there are two costs on the network. One is a congestion cost, which is shared by the flow of both links. That is, you have this component, which is dependent on both the diesel flow and the electric flow. And then you have a second component, which is the fuel costs for each train or goods. That is dependent only on that train or that type of flow. So you have these two components. Now, what we will show later is that this cost function is symmetric with respect to flow of the other type, and that is where we get symmetric traffic assignment. Right. So I'll briefly talk about these cost factors. There are three main types of costs that we consider. The first is link electrification, which are the fixed costs, the infrastructure costs. Then we have the link costs, which are the operational costs, that is the crew and cargo time rates. You have all the fuel costs, which are dependent on things like bearing resistance, air resistance, grade, that is terrain, and so on. And lastly, we have the switching costs at the yards, which it takes up cargo time, crew time, and energy costs. So here's the problem formulation. The upper level, as you can see, is overall network cost minimization subject to total budget constraints and flow conservation. And then the lower level, some of you may be familiar with the traffic assignment problem. This is pretty much the traffic assignment problem. The only difference is because we have symmetric link interactions, the objective function becomes a link integral instead of a summation of independent integrals. Right now, so for solution method, for the upper level, we use a genetic algorithm. You can use any other heuristics as well, such as say particle swarm optimization or any other bi-level program heuristics that you may know. We went with genetic algorithm for one key reason that genetic algorithms do not depend on gradient or Hessian information of the upper level problem. So we could essentially deal with the lack of that information here. And then for the lower level, the first thing that we did for genetic algorithms was, as we mentioned, subject matter experts told us that switching is only possible at yards. So we needed to identify a set of corridors which would allow us to identify candidate corridors for electrification. So we took all the yards and then we generated the shortest paths between those yards so as to generate these corridors. So all of these corridors that you see are essentially shortest paths between neighboring yards. So these are our candidate corridors. This is a visualization. And then for the lower level problem, algorithm B is a Bush-based method used for traffic assignment. It was proved correct for networks without link interactions. So we try to examine whether it functions for networks with link interactions. Here's the algorithm sketch. So there are three main steps. First, you break the link flows down by origin. And then the second step is you shift flows from higher cost paths to lower cost paths. And then the third is you update these bush or tree structures and find new shortest paths. Now, the first and third step don't change. The step that we need to examine is the flow shift step. Now, warning, there's a little bit of math here. I will gloss over it really quickly. But so here's the Jacobian. The reason why we are examining the Jacobian is that the integral cost function needs to be decomposed. And if the Jacobian is symmetric, that is off diagonal elements are 0, then we can decompose it into a sum of integrals. And then as you can see, these are the cost structures we discussed before. Their derivatives are symmetric. So we can then decompose the objective function we discussed before, the link integral, into a summation of integrals. And then the next thing we do is we choose a path order, break the set down into links which are dependent on diesel flow, links which are on the electrified flow, and then links that are not electrified. And then we use fundamental theorem of calculus, and we use the symmetry condition to show that this formula here goes to 0 when the costs between the longest path and the shortest path are minimized. That is exactly what we needed to show that algorithm B works for our use case. So having shown that algorithm B works for the use case, now we have a solution method for our bi-level problem. The upper level is a genetic algorithm, and the lower level is this adapted algorithm B formula. So then let's move on to our case study. The network that we are looking at is the US network. We obtained it from Oak Ridge National Lab. The network size is 35,000 links and 28,000 nodes. As we discussed, the total US network is around 300,000 kilometers. And the shortest path network that we generated for candidate electrification corridors is about 170,000 kilometers. So about 60% of the network that we deemed eligible for electrification. Now, we obtained our demand data and elevation data from these sources. So here's our experiment design. For our base case, we set our budget to about $30 billion worth of electrification, which is about 60,000 kilometers or 20% of the network. And then we conducted some sensitivity analysis where we reduced the budget by about 20%, increased it by 20%. Similarly, we also changed the costs of electrification by about 25% and the expected demand by 25%, both up and down. So again, this is the base network laid out on an elevation chart. The reason I want you to, the important thing here to notice is that there is a lot of elevation here out in the west, mainly the Rockies, whereas out in the east, there's not a whole lot of elevation changes or mountainous region. There is a little bit out here in the northeast, but again, the key here is the Rockies and everything out west. Now let us look at the results of the base case. So this is the US network, and you have this, all the links in the green are the links that are chosen for electrification. Now, the thing that I want to mention here is that, yes, this result in and by itself doesn't have any meaning. It has to be compared to, it has to be validated. And second, it has to be compared to some baselines on what goes on in reality. So as for validation, we looked at the flow patterns provided by Bureau of Transportation Statistics and a couple of other sources. And we observed that we were within 5 to 10% of their results. So we were able to validate this kind of a flow pattern with our cost approximations. And then second, we were able to observe that some of the key intercontinental corridors, such as say Oakland to Chicago or Oakland to Houston, or say Seattle to Chicago, were all being captured in here. These are some of the corridors which are considered high priority and high volume or high density, and these were all being captured here. Now, looking at the sensitivity analysis with a change of budget. Now, the way to interpret this chart is all the links in blue are the low budget case, that is reduced budget. All the links in blue plus the links in green are the base case, the one that we saw previously. And then the links in blue plus green plus red are the high budget case. So as you can see, from the base case, when we move to the low budget case, a lot of the links that are being electrified on the East Coast and in the South are taken away when the budget is reduced. Whereas when we increase the budget, a lot of the links overall in the network are electrified in order to improve general connectivity. One interesting thing that we observed here is that whenever we increased the budget and resolved the problem, all of the links that were included in the lower budget case or base case were included in the high budget case. So none of the links that were chosen for electrification before were dropped out. And that makes sense. If they were important enough to add in low budget cases, then they were important enough in higher budget cases as well. Now, if we look at cost increases, that is cost of fuel and cost of operations, you can see that when costs increase, links in the mountainous regions are electrified, that is all of these blue links mostly. And when costs are reduced, that is base case, then we go into the non-mountainous regions. This is in line with our intuition. And lastly, we look at increased demand. With increased demand, now you can see that the blue, which is the increased demand case, increases general connectivity all over the network. So in general, reach across the network is more important with increased demand than looking at mountainous regions. So just summarizing our notable observations, all of the major intercontinental corridors, that is LA, Chicago, Oakland, Chicago, Seattle, Chicago, or LA, Houston, are all captured. Mountainous regions are well represented along with overall connectivity. Here are some numbers to go with what's the total number of line miles and final flow that will use electric traction. So 13% and 15% respectively. And then lastly, we see that increased costs see more tracks in mountainous regions, whereas increased demand sees more connectivity and in populous regions. So to conclude, we looked at electrification. We proposed a framework to look at, to formulate this problem as well as to solve this problem. And then we solved it on the American railroad network. Some of the limitations of this work are, say, looking at it more from a social benefit maximization rather than cost minimization, as well as incorporating a feedback loop to more accurately capture power levels. Currently, we assume electric power levels as static once we compute them for a link, but these are dynamic. And lastly, we would also benefit from getting better electricity and diesel cost estimates as well. So with that, I would like to conclude my presentation and open the floor up for any questions that you all may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. Are there any questions from the audience? If not, I have some of my own. So, oh, Pablo, please go ahead.
No, go ahead, Adrian.
Sure. Thank you. So just like a quick question. You mentioned elevation a lot, and I just wanted to make sure that I didn't miss anything. How did elevation factor into your calculations for energy requirements for each link?
Absolutely, yeah. So elevation contributed to the fuel costs. So we laid out our network on ArcGIS and then got the grade throughout the link. And then using that, we were able to calibrate our cost functions on the link.
Okay. Pablo, if you want, go ahead, and then I can.
So I have thank you for a great talk. Actually, we have a related project, which is why I'm curious. And so a little bit of like a modeling issue. And so I think that you mentioned that that one of the elements in your optimization model was to select the flows, the corridors that were going to be served. And so the question that I have is, how do you deal with flows that that essentially did not go across the entirety of the corridor, but were basically just in an intermediate sub path? And so in particular, I ask because one could conceive, so of course, if you add, let me let you answer the question, if it's clear.
Yeah, absolutely. So the way we selected these candidate corridors were essentially looking at every yard and getting a shortest path graph only to its neighboring yard. So let's say I'm here in Seattle. Now, I'm not considering the shortest path from Seattle to LA directly. I'm considering the shortest path from Seattle to, say, Portland. Then I'm considering the next candidate as Portland to somewhere in Northern California, and then North California, say, San Francisco to LA. So when we are looking at the genetic algorithm, we very well may have some flow leaving out at Portland. We may have flow getting in at San Francisco, and we may end up electrifying only bits of this. But because trains can only change mode of operation at a yard, you know that flow won't be leaving halfway through, like electric flow won't be leaving midway between Seattle and Portland.
Thank you.
Okay, so I have a question. But that I will say thank you very much, Priya. Great presentation. And I'm sure you're all aware of this battle that's going on between the rail mode and the highway mode. It's a battle that has played out in politics.
Yeah.
In the halls of Congress.
Yeah.
and it's very impactful in terms of what these various modes, bring to the table, and efficiencies in transportation. Okay, so and they are from both sides. Their argument is all centered on one thing: cost. Trying to tell that, hey, it's more cost efficient to use this mode rather than that mode.
Yeah.
So that said, my question to you, Priya, is whether there are any insights in your cost functions that, I mean, how did you develop your cost functions? That's number one. And number two, did they account for scale economies?
Yeah. So to answer your first question, the cost functions. So we have three costs. The first is infrastructure installation costs, that is overhead catenaries or power substations. So those costs are pretty standard. We don't have to develop a cost function for them. The cost functions come in more on the operations part. That is, what are the fuel costs for operation on a link, or what are the diesel costs? Now, this is something that has been well studied in literature. So for vehicles, you have something like the Bureau of Public Roads formula. There are analogous formulae for diesel trains, and then for electric trains, we can develop formulae based on these formulae. They are some kind of similar polynomial formulae kind of thing, like Bureau of Public Roads. As for using scale of economies, that part I think comes more in the infrastructure cost, that is installation costs or overhead power substation, that kind of costs. The operation costs don't necessarily directly correlate to economies of scale costs.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Sam.
Other questions? So I have a few more questions, but maybe, so as Pablo mentioned, we're working on a relatively I guess complementary project right now, looking at rail decarbonization.
Gotcha.
And so I think I just have too many questions to ask in this like a 2-minute window that's left. So I don't know if it would be okay if I
Oh, please, absolutely. Yeah,
okay.
Please, absolutely. Feel free to contact me via email, and we can set up a chat if need be.
Okay, great. That would be great. Thank you. And if there are no more questions from the audience, then I would like to thank both speakers, Deepak and Priyadarshan, for their excellent presentations today, and for the audience for attending and making this just like a really great session. So, yeah. Thank you.
You too.
Thank you.
Amazing.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Right.